Assalamu alaikum. My name is Iltifat Hamzavi. I'm on the board of the Michigan Muslim Community Council. I am so happy to welcome Tariq Hafiz and our legal team and accounting team to this group. And Tariq will be leading the discussions and introducing the whole group. So without further ado and deep gratitude, I'd like to hand it over to Tariq.
All right. Thank you, Iltifat. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining today's presentation. We've got a great panel here of lawyers and financial experts. And really what we want to focus on today are questions that you might have about certain legal obligations, certain opportunities, certain responsibilities that are all, I think, coming to a forefront given the COVID-19 world that we're all unfortunately living through. And before we get started on the presentation, I'd like to just do a quick introduction of our panel. So we have today joining us from Canton, Michigan, attorney Qasim Daklala. Qasim Daklala is a business and commercial litigation attorney with offices in Dearborn. He serves the community throughout Metro Detroit. And he's going to be talking today a little bit about contractual obligations and other types of legal issues around COVID-19. I'm also joined here with my friend Adil Dawoodi, who is also an attorney. His office is in Lansing, but he also services the Metro Detroit area as well. Adil is a business transactional attorney with a focus on estate planning, and he'll be talking a little bit about what is an estate, how do you safeguard your estate, and some basic principles of estate planning for the audience today. I'm also joined here by Mohammed Khalid, who's also from Canton, Michigan. Mohammed is with MK Bookkeeping, an accounting and bookkeeping firm. And Mohammed is going to be giving some advice on the PPP and general issues around that. And also, just a little introduction about myself. I'm with the law firm in Northville, sort of focus on general business law and healthcare law. And inshallah, will serve as the host and we'll get started on the program. So we'd like to do kind of a question answer format. So we're gonna have some questions for each of the panelists. And if anybody is joining this live, you can also send a question on the chat, and I'll try to get those questions answered the best I can using our panel. Anything, Adil, Qasim, Mohammed, you wanna mention before we get started?
Nothing in particular, no. I think we'll cover quite a bit of information as detailed as we can with the time that we have.
Sounds great.
And I'd say, thanks for having us, and we have a lot to cover, so let's get started.
Okay, and I'm just gonna do a quick time check. It's 3:06, so we have about 50 minutes, and hopefully we'll get through most of our content and some questions as well. So, Mohammed, I'd like to get started with the PPP. I think a lot of people have heard about the payroll protection program. Some of our audience may have applied for it. Some have maybe still waiting for it. Some may have already received it. Could you just quickly describe what the PPP is?
Sure. Yeah, the payroll protection program was a government-funded program during COVID-19 to really help small businesses make their payroll obligations. So the initial intent was to prevent people from going onto unemployment, and so that they can provide 2.5 months worth of payroll for small businesses and nonprofits.
Got it. And what was special about this program? What was it that people were applying in hordes to secure these funds?
Yeah, so what's so special about this is if you use it for its original intent and pay payroll expenses worth of 2.5 months, actually the limit is 75% of the loan amount. All of it is forgiven as long as you've documented and as long as you've documented it and you have the documents to prove that you've used it towards payroll.
Okay, and so, we've all heard in the news that the initial round of funds that were allocated for PPP had run out. I know a lot of people had applied and hadn't, received a response, and there was a lot of concern. And then there was a second round of funding for PPP. And I personally have heard of, quite a few business owners that have applied for that second round and have received the funds just as of the last couple of weeks or maybe a week and a half or so. For those who may have applied and have not heard back, do you have any advice for them? And also, related question, if you're a business owner and you haven't gotten around to applying yet, is there still any hope?
Yeah, so it really ultimately bases on the relationship that you have with your bank. So we've seen with a lot of larger banks, and this is something we've seen from our clients, they still are accepting loan applications, but they're still stuck in this pending phase. That's where I encourage a lot of the clients to reach out to the bank to see if, because ultimately it's up to the loan officer in the bank to get those loans approved from the SBA. For people that haven't applied, I strongly encourage you apply because that window still is open for payroll protection. Whether or not that gets approved, again, we're seeing a lot of small people who are nonprofits and businesses have relationship with smaller credit unions and smaller banks were able to get their loan application approved much faster versus some of the larger banks like a Chase or Bank of America.
Okay.
I'll mention, just to kind of mention on that, on the bank side, if there is anybody that is banking with Huntington specifically, and I mentioned them because they're not considered the larger, they're more of a tier 2 size bank. They've changed their model to going online, where about once or twice a week, they will open it up. If you are a Huntington customer and you are able, and you might want to contact the banker to find out when that happens, and you are able to submit the initial application online through Huntington, there is a high likelihood that you will get a call from the banker on that very day, maybe, or the day after. They've been really, really good with servicing their own customers. We've personally experienced where last week I had 4 that got not just submitted, but their SBA number within a matter of hours on the same day. So if you're a Huntington customer, strongly advise you to contact your banker and find out if they are opening that back up. But what Mohammed also mentioned as well, the smaller banks, credit unions have been much more supportive throughout this process than the largers.
Awesome. And let's say that I bank typically with Chase. Do I have to go through my Chase bank to apply, or can I go through another bank? Because I've heard that the larger banks might have, a larger stream of applications, and it may be better to go with the smaller bank. Any thoughts around that?
So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but from what we've seen, there hasn't been other ways where you can apply. It has to be through an SBA approved lender, and that's typically your bank, since they have all your banking information, and you're kind of, if you're eligible, and to repay if you need to. So.
Okay. Mohammed, can you talk a little about what's the maximum amount that you can get from this loan? And also, I know you mentioned this in your introductory comments, but again, just to kind of reemphasize it, how much of that can be forgiven?
Yep. So on the payroll protection loan, it's loans up to 10 million. There's some limitations on who can apply. A small business, according to the Treasury Department, anyone under 500 employees. So if you have under 500 employees, you also have to exclude anyone making over $100,000. So let's say you have employees who are making $150,000, only $100,000 of that can be included towards your payroll protection loan that you're applying for. Also, there is a stipulation that they have to be a full-time employee. They can't be a contractor, 1099 employee. Also, they have to be a US citizen. So if you have Canadian employees on your payroll, they're not counted towards the payroll protection program.
And then for those who have applied and received it, again, just talking to my own network of clients and friends, I've heard of a number of Muslim nonprofits who have received it, alhamdulillah. Also a lot of small businesses that have received it in the last week and a half. I think now the question is, how do I ensure that I get my loan forgiven? And I know that I'm sort of hearing some of the buzz and chatter around this. We don't necessarily still have the clearest guidelines, but I think there are some basic parameters, right, that have been mentioned from day one. So can you maybe either Adil or Mohammed, if you can talk a little bit about what the parameters are for getting the loan forgiven, or any of the panelists?
Sure. I'll go and then I'll pass it on to Adil. One of the main stipulations, and I can't emphasize this enough, is really good record keeping. I know I've worked with a lot of the Muslim nonprofits where kind of the books are scattered all over the place and there's a lot of cleanup that needs to happen. But in order for you to get your loan forgiven, they're going to need some sort of documentation, a good faith documentation saying this is how much we received and this is exactly how we applied it towards our payroll. That's kind of number one. That's going to be a lot of issues a lot of small businesses face since they don't have good record keeping in place. But overall, from what we've received from the Treasury Department is 75% of your loan amount must be used towards your payroll obligations. Also, when you filled out the application, you have to put in an FTE number. So if you had 10 employees on your payroll, by June 30th, you have to either rehire the same amount of employees by June 30th. You need to have those and pay your payroll obligations there. I will talk about there's some ambiguity around some of our nonprofits that reached out to us and said, well, what if we contacted an employee and they said we don't want to come back because we're making more money. We're making more money on the unemployment. In that scenario, the Treasury Department recently released some documentation saying you have to create a document that says your intent to rehire that employee on the same hours and the same costs at the same pay rate that you had them before. If they sign that document and say we don't want to come back, keep that for your records because that's going to be part of your loan forgiveness when you're talking to the SBA. We've suggested to these nonprofits to go out and rehire, or businesses to go out and rehire the same number of FTEs by June 30th. So let's say you had one employee who said, I just don't want to come back. I'm okay with being on unemployment. You need to go out and hire one more person. But the person that refuses to be rehired, they need to understand that from what we've understood from the SBA loan applicator, the loan officers, that person might be subject to a penalty for receiving unemployment when their employer has made a good faith contract to hire them back.
And you mentioned June 30th. My understanding was it's essentially an 8-week period from when you receive the funds. What is the June 30th date? Is that? That's
a date we've gotten from the Treasury Department. So okay. I guess their assumption there is that by June 30th, everyone should receive their payroll protection funds, and by then you should have some sort of process in place to rehire those employees that you are laid off.
Okay. Thank you.
The 8-week period, Tarek, that you're mentioning, I don't know if it was alluded to earlier, it's just the timeline. So from the day the money is put into your bank account, that 8-week time period starts, and you have 8 weeks to essentially spend the money on the appropriated allocated funds.
Got it. Awesome.
Sorry, I just also mentioned there is there's a lot of confusion and talks because a lot of business owners and clients that we've been dealing with, and just from hearing in the news, are experiencing a lot of issues. The fact that the stay-at-home order has forced a lot of companies to be shut down. So they're in a situation where they have the money, but they can't spend it because they can't open up. And it's really cutting into their 8-week time period. So there's been a lot of push on the government, the SBA, or the SBA on trying to extend the time period. So that's something that we'll be looking out for definitely, because it does make sense. If you've been forced to shut down, you can't spend it on payroll. So that's something to look out for.
Yeah, I think what we're hearing from everybody is a lot of still moving parts, and your probably best advice is to stay in touch with your accountant, CPA, or reach out to one of us as things progress, because the news about this program might be changing, or at least being modified as the days go on. Any final comments, Mohammed, about the PPP that you'd like to share with our audience today, or any of the other panelists as well?
No, yeah. I think you hit it. I think you hit it right on the bat. Where, like I said, it's not gonna, the Treasury Department's not gonna make it super easy for a big loan amount to be forgiven without proper documentation. So I would just say, really connect with your accountants or your financial advisors or whoever you have to make sure those systems are in place as soon as you receive the funds.
Great.
Any loan over 2 million, they've stated that they will be auditing those companies if you receive a loan for over 2 million. And the advice that we're kind of giving a lot of clients as well, just to end on that, is just go with the assumption that we may not have everything forgiven. I think the misconception is people are seeing this as free money, that they've received it and it's automatically going to be forgiven on them, and then not realize the actual impact that we're going to have. So it'd be very cautious, and I agree with Mohammed, the documentation is critical, but try to go with the assumption that some of this may not be forgiven.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Adil or Mohammed, if whatever amount is not forgiven, it'll end up becoming a loan at 1% interest for a certain term. I don't recall the term. I don't know if any of you guys know.
8.
I believe it's up to 2 years.
2 years.
8.
Okay.
Well, yeah. So actually, the time period is 2 years, but the amortization, I believe, is 18 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a very favorable loan if you compare it to other commercial loans out there. But of course, most people getting into this are hoping to get that forgiven. So I think, just to kind of wrap up, documentation is key. Stay connected to your financial or legal advisors as things are changing. And inshallah, we'll have some success stories of people getting these loans forgiven in the near future.
Sure.
With that, I wanted to switch to a different topic, and this is again related to COVID-19. A lot of business owners or even individuals are finding it hard to meet their contractual obligations, be it a lease, be it a mortgage, or even other types of contracts. A lot of people are out of work. A lot of people have limited income due to COVID-19. And I'd like Attorney Qasim Daklala to sort of comment on what he's been seeing and what he's been doing with his own clients with regards to negotiating with landlords or other contractual parties when you're having difficulty meeting your obligations due to COVID-19.
Thank you, Tariq. In all of my years as an attorney, probably 95% of the commercial contracts that I've drafted have had a provision in there called a force majeure provision. And it's standard boilerplate language that you'll find in most contracts of any import. And often they just get ignored, because what a force majeure provision in a contract is that in the event that something really catastrophic happens, something out of anybody's control or anybody's expectations, and that makes it difficult or impossible for a contract to be performed, something like an act of God, then that provision says that the parties or one of the parties has the right to suspend their performance under the contract. Now, that never happens. I mean, think something like perhaps the September 11 attacks in New York, or just a massive rebellion or a civil war or a pandemic. These are not things that happen very frequently, but here we are. And so I have clients that have things like lease agreements, commercial lease agreements, and maybe they have a restaurant. And now there's an executive order from the governor that says that restaurants are not able to open lawfully. They cannot open their doors and allow people to come in. But you have this lease that obligates you to pay thousands of dollars a month in order to operate your restaurant. Well, if that lease contains a force majeure provision, which it should, then that provision probably allows the tenant at least some wiggle room to argue that they have the legal right to suspend making payments under the lease to their landlord. And in fact, I've reviewed lots of clients' contracts and have written notices to landlords saying just that the tenant cannot pay the rent because they cannot operate lawfully their business due to circumstances completely out of their control. Now, there's a few things to consider. From a legal perspective, yeah, maybe you have a good legal argument that you don't have the obligation to pay rent. And it doesn't have to be a restaurant. It could be anything, any kind of business. Maybe you have a legal argument that you shouldn't have to pay rent. But there are also practical considerations to keep in mind. Typically, in a normal world where there isn't a pandemic that's killing people, if a tenant doesn't pay their rent, the next thing that happens is they get a notice from their landlord that says, I'm going to evict you from the property. Then they go to court a few weeks after that and they're evicted. And it's usually that simple. But there's a couple things to keep in mind right now in this specific time that might prevent that from happening. Number one, the courts, for the most part, where somebody would go to evict someone are either closed for business or are not allowing people to file eviction cases. They're simply not placing those cases on their docket. So you won't have a hearing even if you were to file one for months from now. So that leads into the second thing that you got to think about, which is a practical thing. It makes sense at this particular time for landlords to work with their tenants and tenants to work with their landlords in order to come to some sort of understanding as to how they're going to operate both in the short term and in the long term. Because it would be, for lots of types of commercial properties, pretty foolish for a landlord at this point to try to evict a tenant, even if they could, for the simple fact that there is so much economic uncertainty that you simply don't know if you're going to be able to get another tenant to come in, or if you do get them to come in, on what rates is somebody going to be willing to sign a lease with you and pay you rent? Especially in this time where here we are on a Zoom conference, we're not using any space to conduct this conference other than our homes for the most part. And so lots of companies are looking at this point, if they're in leases, to get out of them. If they're not in leases, definitely not to get into them. And so the commercial real estate market is definitely in flux for now, and who knows for how long. So it definitely makes sense for landlords and tenants, practically speaking, to work with one another. And it's not even just landlords and tenants. All types of commercial contracts are subject to potential force majeure type considerations. It could be a long-term purchase contract for goods. It could be a manufacturing agreement. It could even be something like a commercial loan. I mean, these things, you got to look at the agreements that you're in and determine what your legal rights are, and from a financial perspective, what makes sense going forward.
Kasim, I'm happy you sort of talked about how this could apply to any kind of commercial agreement. So it could be a supply agreement. It could be, a medical waste disposal agreement. If you're a doctor, you're not able to run your medical office during the shutdown. What about employees? What if I'm a small business owner and I've hired somebody and I've promised them a 1-year term or a 2-year term and I just can't afford to pay them, because my business is shut down? Would the same force majeure type argument potentially work with having to furlough or lay off employees?
All right, so there's a lot of considerations to make when determining what to do with employees. You heard some of them just now with the PPP and those types of things. It gets very complicated, and we could probably have, and I think there's actually one scheduled, an entire series just devoted to employee type issues. But in general, if you have a circumstance, and hospitals are doing this, I mean, across the board, you see that hospitals are cutting salaries, for example, 10 to 20% across the board for all employees. And it's happening in a lot of places. It's been in the news. I think employers are in business to make money, by and large. And employees, this is a bad time. It's just a bad time at this point to be an employee. It's a bad time to be a business owner. There's just, the market hates uncertainty. There's a ton of uncertainty out there. Everybody knows their business best. And just from a practical consideration, it makes sense, I think, for employees to come to some sort of agreement, if necessary, to keep a business viable, to take a reduction in salary, if that's something that would help the business to survive. And it also makes sense for employers to keep people on staff as much as they possibly can, because we don't know where the end of this is happening. We don't know how or when it's going to happen. Everybody knows that it's a lot more difficult to onboard people and train them than it is to keep the people that you have. So if it's a simple matter of a shutdown of the economy and then, I don't know, a miracle, and then there's a vaccine and then a quick restart of things, it makes more sense to retain people. And with programs in place like PPP, where you are able to keep people on payroll, and that's the whole purpose of PPP, is to keep people employed and paid, that facilitates something like that. But in general, in the state of Michigan, with limited exceptions now specific to COVID-19, every employment relationship is an at-will employment relationship. And so any employer at any time could terminate any employee, no questions asked. And any employee can choose to quit anytime, no questions asked. There are tons of exceptions that would apply, and some are specific to COVID-19. It's a long, drawn out question to answer. So hopefully I've provided some considerations for that.
Sure. And this question I'm going to open up to Adil, Mohammed, or anyone on the panel who would like to take this one. But kind of leaving aside business owners for a second here, obviously a lot of people in general, they may have booked travel to go to Umrah or Hajj. They may have booked travel for vacations and holidays. They may have vacation rentals, different things. How are you seeing those types of situations being dealt with? Are companies by far and large proactively giving people options to reschedule and refund their money? Have you seen any type of legal pressure needing to be put to bear on any of these situations? Any comments around that? Because one question I do get a lot of is, for people who have booked trips, overseas and things, even for late summer or the fall, and there's still so much uncertainty about whether or not those trips will be able to be actualized.
So I can speak personally on that one. We did have a trip that was actually booked for Umrah in April that we ended up obviously having to cancel. And we had booked it through Etihad to fly there and throughout. And with them, we were able to get our money back. The hotels, which we had booked in Mecca and Medina, we did through booking.com. So initially in the very beginning, they had mentioned to us that that they would cancel, but we had to get the next booking already done through them, which obviously that's where the back and forth was happening, that there was too much uncertainty for us to be able to commit to anything. So, I mean, at the end of it, they humbly gave us a credit. They weren't willing to give us the money back, but inshallah, the idea is that we'll book again. But yeah, so we ended up getting a credit through that, so which we'll use for later. But that's just on a personal experience. I don't know from generally what's happening with others.
Yeah, I do know of a situation, again, a travel-related situation where somebody had booked a vacation rental for the summer, and it's become very clear that it's not going to be able to be used. But this was not done through a big hotel chain. It was done through like an Airbnb type deal, and they were getting some pushback from the property owner. that, hey, we're not going to refund the money, or we don't know for sure yet if June is going to be viable or not. So I suspect when you're dealing with sort of smaller mom and pop type businesses, you might get some pushback. Whereas the larger, established chains obviously have, a certain level of professionalism and legal advice, and they know how to handle these claims. So in this particular situation, it did take a letter from a lawyer to kind of put some pressure on them to be more reasonable. And that's something that you might find, again, is if you're getting pushback on something that, just seems unreasonable, but there's no way you can go and spend your weekend at on Lake Michigan in June, given everything that's happening. You could sometimes get some help from a lawyer or somebody who knows how to write a demand letter. You could write a demand letter yourself, but that sometimes will do the trick. So it's something to keep in mind. And I think definitely nobody should be losing money over something that's out of their control. So you really should, take that up. Kasim, you and I were speaking a few weeks ago about a pretty interesting situation involving a client of yours. I think COVID-19, aside from the commercial transactions and, leases, there's also an effect on those who are currently serving time in prisons. And there have been arguments made. I know just very recently there was an argument made by a criminal organization in Detroit, some Detroit mafia, that the inmates should be released due to COVID-19, and that was rejected. But you are seeing in the news that there is a chance for certain kind of low-risk prisoners to be released earlier than their sentence, dictates. Can you talk about that? And sort of, for anyone here who might have a loved one who's incarcerated, are there any opportunities to petition the government or petition the prison for early release or bond release?
Right. So the Attorney General, William Barr, he wrote a memorandum to the Board of Prisons in the United States, and he made a recommendation that the Board of Prisons should seek as much as possible to release early or to home confinement people that are in the federal prisons who are nonviolent offenders and who have shown good behavior within the prison system. And so there have been circumstances where prisons, as you can imagine, you cannot socially distance in a prison. You cannot, once there is a virus, particularly one that is very infectious, such as COVID-19, there's no way to get away from it. The whole population is going to get infected, and people are going to die, and they have died in the prisons, throughout the country. Particularly people who are have comorbidities, people that have underlying health conditions that makes contracting the virus more dangerous, things like hypertension, diabetes, and so forth. And so, I mean, just speaking anecdotally, I had a client that was in federal prison on a nonviolent offense who had an underlying health condition that made COVID-19 potentially critical or fatal should he have contracted it. And so I filed a motion with the court, and the Board of Prisons then ordered that my client be moved over to quarantine for 14 days and then released from prison. And so he was released about 10 days or so ago, and he's now home. And the rest of his sentence, which is about a year remaining, he's going to serve under home confinement. There are various ways to try to achieve release from prison, both at the state and the federal level, specifically relating to COVID-19, whether it's a motion for bond, whether it's a motion for home confinement, whether it's a motion for compassionate release. But definitely this is something that the prison system in this country, both at the federal and the state level, is considering, and people are being released as they should.
That's great. So you've had a successful example in your own practice with getting somebody out. That's awesome. Before we move on to the next topic, one more topic that we hear a lot of questions about is folks who are paying mortgages are having difficulty paying mortgages. There's been a lot of buzz that there may be some leniency on missed mortgage payments. Kasim or Adil, can you maybe provide a little bit of background on that?
Sure. I'll take the lead on that for a second, Adil. But actually, when the CARES Act got passed in mid-March, there was a provision in the act. I mean, there was tons of press about the CARES Act and about the stimulus and PPP and all these things. But one of the lesser publicized portions of the CARES Act relates to mortgage payment relief. And so immediately upon the passage of the act, there was a 60-day moratorium on all residential foreclosures throughout the country. And so that moratorium expires on May 18th. But from the period of March 18 to May 18, there was not a legal way for a mortgage company to foreclose on anybody's home. After May 18th, there is a mandatory provision within the CARES Act where all federally chartered or federally backed mortgages, things like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, VA loans, all of those loans are subject to a forbearance if the homeowner contacts their mortgage loan servicer. So the servicer is the company that you make your payment to every month. And that's just kind of like the storefront, but behind it is the actual mortgage. And if that is owned by the federal government or backed by the federal government, then the servicer has to give you a forbearance simply because you told them that due to COVID-19, you are experiencing a difficulty in paying your mortgage loan payment. And so initially, everyone who does this qualifies for a 180-day forbearance in payments. So 6 months, no mortgage payments. And during that 6-month period, those payments are they're not accruing any additional interest. You don't get any late fees charged. You don't get any derogatory hits on your credit report or anything like that. They're simply not due. And the CARES Act also provides that at the end of that 6-month period, if you're still facing difficulty, you can ask for another 6-month forbearance, another extension, and the same thing happens again. At the end of the forbearance period, whether it's 6 months or a year, the mortgage company at that point is going to make some sort of deal in order to get those missed payments made, whether it is to just simply put them at the back of the loan or make a lump sum for that amount that you didn't pay due at the end of the loan, or maybe make a payment plan for some period of months to catch up on those payments. But it really is that simple. If you just contact the mortgage company, I mean, they may have like a little application for you to fill out or something, but if they're a federally backed mortgage loan, they're going to give you a forbearance.
That's amazing to know, and thanks so much for sharing that information. And I'm assuming if people don't know if their mortgage is federally backed or not, that's something they can call their servicer and ask.
Yeah, simply contact the mortgage loan servicer and ask them that question, and they'll tell you.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, Kasim. Mohammed, I wanted to ask you really quickly on tax filings. I know people oftentimes obviously have their taxes filed by April 15th or the end of April, but they've heard about these extensions of the tax filing deadline. What is that extension? When do they have to have their taxes filed by?
Yeah, so for single member LLCs and individuals, that deadline has been extended to July 15th.
Okay.
Now for LLCs, like partner LLCs and S Corps, or if you're an LLC taxed as an S Corp, that deadline has already passed, which was March 15th. We encourage people to go ahead and apply for an extension if they don't think that they can even make the July 15th deadline. But in general, you do have to make your estimated payment of what you're gonna owe by July 15th. You can extend the filings 6 months if you do the extension, but you do need to have something in by July.
Okay. So if somebody hasn't filed their personal taxes, they're not getting hit on any kind of interest on what they owe until it's really July. It's been pushed to July 15th, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, if they owe money. Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
If they owe. Right. And are you finding people who are filing, are they getting if they're owed any type of money back from the IRS? Are they getting that, or is there some kind of slowdown in getting those funds?
Yeah, those funds are definitely coming in. It's at a much slower pace because IRS offices are closed. So, for example, if you're doing paper filings right now, the IRS has just simply told us they're not checking their paper filings. They've asked us to fax those documents over to them. So there's just some leeway for how you have to kind of work around the system. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I wanted to move to a different topic. This is one that I'm seeing a lot in my own practice, and I know Adil has also been seeing this quite a bit. People are wanting to know more about estate planning. I think sometimes crises, situations like this sort of get people thinking about putting their house in order, making sure that they're thinking about, securing their estate, making sure they're providing for their family. And we thought we could maybe touch upon just some basics of estate planning for the audience here. And of course, this is a much longer subject as all the topics that we talked about today. But Adil, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just sort of talking briefly about what is estate planning. Like, people hear this term estate planning. What is estate planning?
Sure, yeah. On a definition level, estate planning, essentially what we're talking about is pretty much the planning of the transfer of your assets upon your death. That's on a very simplistic general overview of what it is essentially looking at what you have, what you've earned, and then having the discussion of what happens to all of us if something was to happen to you. Now, a couple of ways on how to actually get that achieved. I mean, for the most part, a lot of us unknowingly have already established an estate plan without formally drafting of something. And that's by way of, people out there, when you have your bank accounts, for example, or your investments, your 401ks, with these assets that a lot of people have, you've assigned beneficiaries to those, right? When you create a 401k plan or an IRA, you're asked at the time of it being established that who do you want it to go to upon you passing? That right there is the textbook definition of your estate plan. You've established an asset and you've designated a beneficiary. Now, when we get into situations where you do not have people assigned as a beneficiary, for example, your home, certain bank accounts that you might have, a business, properties, vehicles and things such as that, there are other means of what would be established and drafted to help identify how those assets are going to be transferred. And what we're getting at is essentially, the will component versus a trust. And when we get into that discussion, as Tarek mentioned, this is a conversation that can be much longer discussed, but a lot of times what people, when they look at and think about their estate plan, they start and end with a will. And that is one of the more common and more popular documents for several reasons. Cost is one, simplicity is another. The misconception that you have to be a multimillionaire to do anything more than a will. When we get into the discussion of a trust, there's that stigma attached to a trust that you have to have significant amount of assets to justify having it, which is not necessarily the case. But if we were to boil down the main differentiating factor between a will and a trust, summed up in one word, and that's probate, which is a process that a lot of people would prefer to avoid if they had just known about it and if they were familiar with it. And what I mean by probate really is the court system. So the general rule is that if you have an asset that is titled in your personal name, and you pass away, that asset will have to go through the court system. And why does it go through the court system is because it is not as simple as you passing away and then your family just taking the asset and putting into their name or taking the money from the account. There needs to be some authority given to them, and that authority is given to them by the court, essentially. And a lot of times people would prefer to avoid having to go or wanting to go through probate or the court process for a few different reasons. One being cost. On average, probate in Michigan can cost anywhere about 1% to 2% of the value of your gross estate. And that's factoring in the potential cost of attorney fees if people are going through that process. What happens essentially is that when you pass, the court will ask for a list of assets that you've passed away with, and then they would require you to identify the value of those assets. Once that's identified, then the court will ask you for a percentage of that. And that's one of the inventory fees that gets paid. Second thing that a lot of people would want to avoid, and this is more of a subjective value that I always mention, is that going through probate is a public process. It is a process that people will be able to openly look at what you have, what your will said, who it goes to, and how it's being given and all. So that's another part that people would typically want to avoid. And then you get into the duration of it. Probate is not as simple as you pass away today, your assets are distributed tomorrow. There is a long, tedious timeline and period that goes into it and all. So when we contrast that all, and giving a quick 5-minute summary on all this, when we contrast that all with the trust, essentially what happens in a trust is that you avoid that whole process. You avoid having to go through probate. And the reason you avoid it is essentially what happens is you transfer assets into the name of a trust. So the title is technically being taken out of your name and being put into a trust name that you still control. And when that transfer happens, you now pass away with an asset that is not titled in your name. And because it's not titled in your name, you don't go through the probate process. And I'm trying to summarize this up in a quick few minutes. It is a long presentation that goes into it, but I'm hoping it makes a little bit of sense here from what we're discussing. And in addition to avoiding probate, a trust is private. Nobody needs to know your business. You don't have any additional variable costs associated with it. It doesn't necessarily matter if you pass away with $100,000 or $1 million in your estate. There's no additional costs that comes into it, with the exception of the super wealthy when we get into estate tax and all, which is in excess of $5.5 million or so. And then the distribution process is a lot smoother. I mentioned when you have a will and you go through probate, it's on the court's time, with meaning it doesn't just happen necessarily the next day. Well, with the trust, it could. Individual passes, essentially the next day, the assets that are in the trust can be distributed in accordance to the instructions you've laid out. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense, Tariq, in answering your question in a roundabout way.
No, thank you. And Adil, I mean, if I'm somebody, sitting here listening to this presentation and I don't have a will, but I feel like it's something that I should do, either a will or a trust, am I still better off having a will than not having a will? Let's say the trust is something that I'm not sure about. Would you recommend that at least I get a will done? And what type of timeline are we talking about to get a will created?
Yeah.
A lawyer.
Regardless of which avenue is best for you, and that discussion is best to have with when you speak to the attorney and look at the differences of what your personal situation is. Having something in place is still critical. And if we're just to talk about the will component, and the main reason I would advise on that is because you control your distributions. If you were to pass away with not having any estate plan, you're leaving it in the hands of the state that will dictate how your assets will be distributed in accordance to state laws. Whereas right now, you control that, you decide. And then if we further that and have the conversation on, the Sharia component of things. Well, in that sense, we've been given how distributions are to occur. So that's something that we've got control of being able to do now, and having something in place. So for that reason alone, and in addition, for anyone that is listening or will be listening, Cheryl, in the future, would be if you've got minor children. Having minor children, the simple question that we ask is, we get that a lot. A lot of people get this thought that estate planning is for people who are retired or for people over 65, and I'm 30, 40, 25, I don't really need to think about it. But if you have a minor child, the question we ask is, if something happens to one of you or both of you, husband, wife in the situation, who's going to look after the child? And the answer we get is, well, my sister or my parents or whatnot. But it's not as simple as them just being able to take the kid home. There's a process that goes into a legal process, and that legal process would be the court system, where if you have not identified who your guardian is going to be, then again, you're now leaving it in the court's hands, in the judge's hands, to decide who is the best person to raise your children. And that all comes back to control. You plan in advance, you have all the control in advance to decide how things are going to occur. You fail to plan in advance, then you're leaving it in state laws and a judge's hands to decide what's best for you.
Thank you, Adil. Adil, could you touch upon, maybe just for 30 seconds or a minute, what a living will is, or a medical directive, and why that's important?
So we're getting to the healthcare power of attorney side of things, and the power of attorney discussion as a whole. So essentially when we talk about healthcare power of attorneys, which is an additional document that goes into as part of an estate plan, is a situation where if you're unable to make your own medical decisions, who do you have selected that's going to make it for you? This is a situation, if you're in an irreversible coma, vegetative state, you come down with Alzheimer's, dementia, and you're unable or unfit to make medical decisions, it is critical as well to have that power of attorney document by your side to make sure that, again, the person you've selected is there and able and willing to make those decisions and step into your shoes. Where again, if you fail to have that document, the process is going through the court system again to have somebody selected. And just for purpose of the time, I won't get into that discussion, but it is not a smooth process. It is a costly process, and it is a dreadful process, especially if time is of essence.
Thank you so much, Adil. I know we're kind of running up against the hour. I just wanted to again thank the panelists, Qasim Taklala, Adil Dawoodi, Mohammed Khalid. The information for all of our panelists is on your screen. All these topics that we touched upon today, we really just done a very shallow dive into them. We hope, inshallah, you find this information helpful. But if you have any further questions, you want some more advice on any of these topics, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We're more than happy to take your call and give you whatever information and advice we can. And with that, Iltafat, if you want to take over, are there any questions from the audience, or?
We have a few panelists, and if they have any questions, we can take those, but then we'll be posting this on the MMCC website and then sharing on our social media. We'll also be adding the information on the various participants today. And also for the people who will be watching, just want to remind you that we have tremendous talent in our community. These are some of the best lawyers and accountants in our area, and I've actually worked with almost all of them. And so I want to thank them for this time. In addition, I want to remind everybody that we have the Eid TV program coming up on Eid, and we will have our Muslim businesses advertising their work on WXYZ's affiliate channel 20, and then they'll be rebroadcast on channel 7. And also we're welcoming every community to offer a message of hope and celebration on Eid Day, and that'll be on the Sunday of the Eid weekend. So thank you so much for your time,